So last week we discussed in general how the idea of secession was always present in the United States in one way or another. Interestingly, the idea of secession originated really with the northeastern states rather than with the southern states. And we went through a couple of examples which demonstrated that the idea of secession or the willingness to break away and be independent was often based on purely economic reasons, purely societal reasons, purely other reasons other than slavery. Slavery early on was not an idea that originated or proposed secession. The Compromise of 1820, during which Missouri was admitted as a slave state and Maine was admitted as a free state, was all about power in the U.S. Senate. The issue of slavery may have been invoked, but the real basis for the conflict was the balance in the U.S. Senate, which the southern states appreciated very much. And the fear of loss of that power was very intimidating to the southern states. After that was done in the 1820s, the main issue 200 years ago were the tariffs. And the tariffs have remained an issue up to the present day. One of our candidates is promising a 10% tariff on everything coming from China. And a tariff is basically a very focused tax on products coming from a specific country, a specific product, a specific amount. The idea of a tariff is twofold. Number one, to generate revenue, makes money for the government. Number two, it only protects or favors the local manufacturer. Imagine this. Lowe's company wants to purchase 50,000 shovels, and they can get it from several sources. One source will charge to them $10 each. Another source will charge them that plus a tariff, $12, $13. Which one are they going to buy? The cheaper one, of course, so that they can sell more of those and make more profit. So that's the whole idea about a tariff. And so in the 1820s, this was 200 years ago. This was not yesterday, it was 200 years ago. Tariffs up to 45% were placed on products coming from Europe, primarily wool, iron, cotton bagging, particularly to help the northeastern states, much to the detriment of the southern states. South Carolina apparently got the worst end of the deal here because they needed all those things produced in the northern states and in Europe, and they did not produce any themselves. So they were, in a way, heavily taxed by the federal government with little or no return. Other things happened in South Carolina. People left South Carolina for the Mississippi states. So the population went down about 15%. That's what the books say. The slave population was about 65% at that time. And generally the economy in South Carolina was not that good. at that time. So of course, South Carolina was very much against the tariffs. And they were quite sensitive to the criticism of their peculiar institution.
Okay. What were they referring to when you said peculiar institution? Is that just
So sorry.
what was the term peculiar institution? What was that referring to? Is that
Slavery.
oh, slave. Oh,
Slavery. I was a euphemism for slavery. They referred to that, both sides referred to it as their peculiar institution. John C. Calhoun, at that time, we're talking the 1820s, was probably the most preeminent politician in South Carolina. At this time, he was vice president of the United States. This is a man who occupied many positions, was lifetime Secretary of War, Secretary of State, was a senator. He was vice president under two different presidents, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And being vice president, he wrote a long paper called the South Carolina Exposition of Protest. I think that the link is in your hand. If you wanted that, in case you wanted to read the whole thing that is electronic. He argued that the tariffs were unconstitutional because they favored a segment of the economy and not everybody. The tariffs, he argued, should generate income, not provide protection. That was his argument. And finally, the most poignant argument was that a state had the power to veto or nullify any act of the federal government that went against the Constitution. Not the Supreme Court, the state. The state could say, this piece of legislation was not applied to us. This piece of legislation is nullified within the boundaries of this state. But that was found.
right.
Yes.
I have a question. On that second one, I don't understand how the tariffs could only generate income but not provide protection.
That was his argument.
I don't see how you could.
These men were very, very argumentative. They could sell ice to the Eskimos. That's how convincing they were. And some of the arguments, like the arguments we hear nowadays from politicians, really don't make sense. But they stretch them out and spin them enough to be able to appear quite formidable. So yes, this was his opinion, that the tariffs should generate income for the government and not provide protection. Throughout all of these documents, John C. Calhoun kind of feels overburdened, feels that the state of South Carolina has been dumped on, and decides or wishes for relief from those burdens. One doesn't go, the other one doesn't go either.
Are the wheels not? I think it's because I was putting the chat on the, I touched the screen, so now I have to give you back authority. Oh, thank you. Okay.
All right, good.
Ah,
All right.
where you want to go?
Thank you. Thank you.
Haven't had to do that in a year.
So these arguments went on to the legislature, which initially in 1828 defeated a proposal for a nullification convention that is to create a group that would address only that issue, a convention only for the nullification proposal. Eventually, the nullification convention met and decided to nullify the tariffs in February of 1833. And also they provided funds for an armed force, a state armed force. 2,000 men, 25,000 troops, and $100,000 in arms, which at that time was a lot. In other words, they were ready to fight. This was 1832. South Carolina was ready to fight. They had passed the nullification resolution, and they had formed an army with arms.
And what was the source of the $100,000? Where did they get that money? From their own state gathering
Just from the
taxes?
state, yeah.
And so if they don't have to pay the tariffs, then they had the freedom to barter or to purchase the iron and the other materials they wanted from the other countries. And that while the other countries would have a tariff imposed on those goods coming in, South Carolina would not impose it. Is that what you're saying? Huh.
South Carolina certainly was up against the federal government.
So they must have had agents that were going to do this kind of bartering and not go through one central source.
Oh, absolutely.
Huh.
All right. The country in South Carolina and the surrounding states was divided into the nullifiers and the nationalists. The nullifiers believed that the Constitution and the federal government were a product of the states, and the states could judge what was constitutional, not the Supreme Court. On the other hand, the nationalists felt that the federal government had supreme authority over the states, and the Supreme Court had final jurisdiction. The crisis continued and brought in President Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson made it very, very clear that he was with the nationalists and not with South Carolina. He said, and he makes this very, very explicit, if a drop of blood is shed in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hand the first man I can lay my hand on engage in such conduct upon the highest tree in the state. Make no bones about it. Number two, he ordered the Army and the Navy in South Carolina to be rotated on the basis of their political leanings. He had a naval squadron ready to go to Charleston, mobilized the Navy. He maintained communications with unionists in South Carolina, strengthened the federal facilities like the warehouses, the stations, and whatnot. And he sent a force bill to Congress, asking Congress to authorize the federal government to use federal troops in enforcing federal law. In other words, to use United States troops to enforce the laws of the United States that were being broken by United States citizens. That was quite an idea, to use the country's armed forces against its own citizens. Nowadays, we say, well, yeah, no big deal. Why? Because we have seen it done so many times, particularly during the civil rights period where federal troops and federal marshals went many places trying to enforce the federal laws. But this was unique, asking permission from Congress to use the Navy and Army to enforce federal laws. He also wrote a proclamation to the people of South Carolina. He addressed that to the people of the state, not to the convention that had approved the nullification resolution. He went beyond that. He went to the public in general. And the message was, you don't want to go there. This is going to turn nasty. Violence is implied. Give up. Don't pursue this anymore. South Carolina said, maybe we shouldn't. So they sent the troops away from Charleston and delayed the implementation of the nullification proclamation. In other words, they stepped out. Eventually, it went to Congress, where Henry Clay from Kentucky proposed the compromise bill. What they did was agree that the tariffs would decrease 10% every 2 years until they reach 20%. 20% tariffs, okay, if it was 46%, 20% doesn't sound that bad. You give them half, we'll meet you there, halfway there. Basically, that's what they do. So the House approved the tariff, the force bill 3-1. The Senate approved everything too. But South Carolina itself nullified or repealed the nullification ordinance and nullified the force bill, which is funny because they had to have the last word by nullifying the force bill. That was a confrontation between the federal government and the state government over tariffs. Had nothing to do with slavery. This was all over money. This was all secondary to the economic environment that they were experiencing at that time. What did they learn? Well, the nullification crisis was very interesting because it let all sides look into the situation and realize how things could have gone different one way or another. South Carolina did not receive any support from any of the states. When they published and approved the nullification ordinance, they were alone. They had no other support. So they immediately learned, if we ever go against the federal government again, we need support from other states. We cannot do it on our own. Big lesson we learned. Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi actually criticized South Carolina. So they were against South Carolina in its conflict with the federal government. They needed unity, which they did not have. Coordinated action was necessary, but was lacking. President Jackson was superb in handling the crisis. It was very, very strong. Nowadays, they would have called him a fascist. Nowadays, everybody who is strong is being called a fascist. But he knew what he had to do in order to right the problem and solve the crisis. He acted very, very courageously. If there has to be violence, there has to be violence. We'll give you a chance to de-escalate before there is violence. And that worked. Jackson very wisely said, look, the tariff was just a pretext. This was just an excuse. Disunion was the real subject. The independence of South Carolina and the southern states. This was a struggle over power. The next issue, sooner or later, will be slavery. Jackson predicted that 30 years before it occurred, that the next conflict would be over slavery. But slavery would be like the vessel that would carry the conflict. The same way that here, it was the tariff, the vessel that carried the conflict. The next problem that developed was the annexation of Texas. And you will forgive me if we go over this rather fast, because we could spend hours and hours on the story of the annexation of Texas, which is one of the most peculiar of all stories about politics in the United States. Texas was part of Mexico. Mexico had won independence from Spain in 1821. And people from the South had been invited to come to Texas, which was only very sparsely populated at that time. Many Anglo-Americans went to Texas and took their slaves with them. By mid-century, Texas was about 20% slaves, much less than South Carolina. But a good number of slaves. There was a problem with slavery in Texas because the Mexican government had forbidden slavery in Texas, when Texas was part of Mexico. On the other hand, the immigrants from the South that went into Texas, they took their slaves with them. So right away there was a conflict there about what to do with these people. Eventually, the Mexican army entered Texas in 1835, and a year later, Texas declared independence from Mexico. Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna in 1836 and granted independence to Mexico, even though he eventually called that. He said that he had been under duress. He had lost the battle. Of course, he was under duress. No question about it. Texas, as an independent nation, did not do well. The economic problems were severe and widespread. The price of cotton fell. They hardly had any income, the state of Texas. They had a small militia. They could not get enough labor. They incurred a lot of debt, the state of Texas. And the Americans that had gone from the southern states to Texas said, we'd like to be in the Union. We'd like Texas to be in the United States. Of course, annexation of Texas would create a lot of problems. Number one, the size of Texas would be enough to produce at least 4 states. 4 slave states that would give the southern states a lot more power in the Senate than the North had. The North otherwise would have to absorb the emancipated slaves or ship them to Africa or ship them to Central America, which would cost a lot of money. The northern states did not want to assume at expense. And Mexico certainly threatened war and broke relations with the United States over Texas. At this time, the army of Mexico was much larger than the federal army. So size-wise, the army in Mexico was superior to that of the United States. There were other problems. It was not just Mexico and Texas and the United States, but England wanted some territory in the Southwest, and France apparently had a number of very large loans, which they did not want to default on. So there were 5 parties involved in the negotiation over Texas. 5 parties with very large interests. Initially, they tried a treaty with the Republic of Texas, but this was not ratified by the Senate. Then it was a joint resolution that was approved by the House and by the Senate in 1845. This joint resolution was filled with the utmost chicanery you can imagine. Every kind of deal was made. There were secret funds. Nixon had nothing of them. There was money under the table. There were agreements made and broken. There were double crossings. There were diplomatic leaks, diplomatic documents that were passed on to the press piecemeal to influence this or that. The best of American politics. You ever want to be thoroughly entertained or put to sleep, read about this episode in American history. And I beg your forgiveness for skimming over this, otherwise we'd be here until the end of the course. The annexation of Texas and also Manifest Destiny contributed to the Mexican War. There's no question that the Mexican War was an effort to grab land, particularly the western states with the major ports in modern Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. Control of those ports enabled the United States to engage in commerce with the Far East, with Russia, with what is now Alaska, which was Russian at that time, with Mexico, with South America, opened up a totally new world. This was pie in the sky against those West Coast ports. The USA invaded the area between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, which is about 100 miles. So it was not a little bit of territory, it was a large territory. And that territory had always been recognized as being part of Mexico, part of the state of Coahuila. But no, the United States went there and invaded, and then when the Mexicans fought back, aggression, war. So they had their war declared in the spring of 1846. It stopped in the fall of 47, and the treaty was signed on February 2nd, 1848. The result was that the border was set at the Rio Grande rather than the Nueces River. You imagine, otherwise all those immigrants would be coming across the Nueces River, not the Rio Grande. History would have been different. And the land that was sold to the United States for $15 million included California, Nevada, Utah, most of what is now Arizona, about a third of New Mexico, Colorado, and a little bit of Wyoming. All that land for $15 million. Of course, Mexico had no choice but to sell. Sure, we'll give you this land for that money. Eventually, they had to purchase more land down here, the Gaston Purchase, which was destined to be the route of the transcontinental railway. We'll come to that shortly. There were other things going on at that time. One was the appearance of various publications. One of these publications was The Liberator. The Liberator was a weekly published by William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was one of these bitter abolitionists that wanted all slaves free now, immediately, no strings attached, no compensation for the owners, freedom for the slaves now, period. That was a radical abolitionist. He condemned slavery on moral and ethical grounds, and he was also for women's rights. Other abolitionists were Douglas, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Susan B. Anthony, the one who invented the dollar coin, John Brown, Harriet Tubman, and many others. Leslie Phillips was an attorney in New England who actually had a movement to expel the southern states from the Union in order to get rid of slavery. Let them go out there and have their own slavery. Another thing that happened was the introduction of gag rules in Congress. To us, in this day and age, the gag rules appear somewhat unbelievable. But interestingly, the concept was, and we have mentioned this before, that many believed that slavery had been dealt with in the Constitution. And there was no need to discuss slavery at the federal level. That slavery was a state issue. The same way that right now many believe that abortion is not something to be discussed or dealt with at the federal level, but is an issue to be discussed and dealt with at the state level. This was a pretty common understanding at that time, that slavery was a state issue. And there was really no point in discussing that in the federal Congress. It was felt, particularly by Henry Whitney of South Carolina, that Congress had no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery. That's why eventually they had to come up with the 13th Amendment. Because before that, this idea that Congress had no business with slavery was commonplace and was widespread. Congress should not interfere with slavery in the District of Columbia. And finally, all petitions on the subject of slavery would be tabled, meaning ignored. Now, the Liberator, the newspaper, the weekly that we referred to before, encouraged people to write to Congress, send them petitions over and over and over, flood them with petitions regarding slavery. And people did. What did Congress do? out of sight, out of mind. Deep six, all of them. And this was in place for a number of years, about 8 years, that these resolutions were enforced. The other problem that developed was something very human, and that is fear. Fear of a servile insurrection, fear of violence. Because it did happen. Take, for example, Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave born in Virginia in 1800. He was taught how to read and how to write, and he actually became a preacher. He had visions, and he heard voices. We all hear voices, but that's not visions. He heard a loud noise in the heavens. The Spirit appeared to me. God gave me the task of slaying my enemies with their own weapons. They probably had hallucinations. Or God those idea from the Bible, very hostile God of the Hebrews. In I think it was 1830, one summer day he led 70 slave and free blacks from house to house in Virginia, killing white men, women, and children with everything that they could find. They eventually killed 60 people before they were stopped. The state of Virginia picked up 56 slaves. In Malaysia, about 100 more. So there were hundreds of people killed between the slaves and the white folks in Virginia. And this created, of course, a lot of fear because slaves had access to all of these sharp instruments. They also had access to their homes. There was no 911 that they could call and get help right away. Everybody lived in fear. And of course, both sides capitalized on this fear to advance their position. What was the reaction to Nat Turner's rebellion? There was increased funding for colonization, that is, for taking slaves and limited freedom as long as they left the continent, off to Africa or to South America or Central America. That was colonization. Hitler was very much for colonization for a long time. Blacks were denied trial by jury. Free blacks convicted of crimes were sold into slavery. It became illegal to teach slaves to read and write. You needed to have a white minister at any religious meeting. Abolitionist literature was criminalized. The U.S. mail was forbidden to deliver. And arsenals were built as black schools were destroyed. There was a lot of reaction to Nat Turner's rebellion.
Right. That's state laws are criminalized, the mail, federal laws.
It was all state. It was all state. The northern states, many felt that Nat Turner was a hero of the abolitionists and a martyr in the struggle. For more moderate individuals, he was misguided, ignorant, deranged, and his actions and methods were not widely supported. On the other hand, the southern states believed that Nat Turner was a terrorist, that the Liberator, the newspaper, was responsible for the rebellion. Even in today's day and age, they have to find somebody that is responsible for everything. This happens. This is the story of us. slavery was a positive good, and basic denominator was fear, fear, fear. If this happened in Virginia, it can happen to you, and you, and you. The American Colonization Society was established in 1816 to help slaves get their freedom and return to Africa and Central America, because it felt that free blacks could not be integrated into white America. The Colonization Society was predominantly white. You can see in this document that is signed by Henry Clay. The other founder of the Colonization Society was a nephew of George Washington. So these were people who meant well, but they realized that integration was not immediately possible and did not want integration to occur. The Colonization Society resettled about 10,000 former slaves to Africa and to Central America. It dissolved in 1964. After the Civil War, it became an education society, a public service society. But it remained around for many, many years. All right, we're doing good. We're ready for more problems, and this was a major problem. Let me give you the background. In the middle of the 19th century, elections took place in November, more or less, in the fall of even years. Okay, do we all agree on that? Just like nowadays, 2024, it's an even year, elections take place in the fall. All members of the House of Representatives and a third of the senators are elected. We all agree so far? When do they meet? Mid-century, in the mid-1800s, they met not that December, but the following December. In other words, a year and a month after the election. Did you know that?
No.
You see, didn't teach you this in high school? You better go get your money back. And that's the thing that we need to understand. First of all, that the legislators that were elected on a given year, given even year, will only meet for the first time, the first week in December, a year afterwards.
What was their reasoning? What was their reasoning to wait so long?
They had to travel. People who came to Washington had to do something with their estates. Many of them were gentlemen farmers. They wanted to be home for the harvest. It was not easy to come from Minnesota to Washington or from Louisiana to Washington or from California to Washington. It was very, very difficult to travel. There were no telephones, and they had to make arrangements to leave their estates in order in good hands before they would absent themselves from home and come to Washington. So this is why there was this long period. The presidents that were elected every 4 years waited 4 months to take office. They would not take office until March 4th. All right, so what happened when they came to Washington? They came to Washington and each Congress had two sessions. One was a long session, the first one, that began the first week in December and lasted almost through the summer of the following year. That was the first long session. And then they had another session the following December that lasted only through the winter. That was the second or short session. By the time they met the second time, a new Congress had been elected. So they were lame ducks. They still had the power to legislate. But a totally new Congress was coming at the end of that year. You get me so far? Good. All right, let's go back to the bewilderment device. In 1846, which is an even year of the election, this was the end of the long session of Congress. It was the very last day the Congress was meeting. The president sent Congress a request for $2 million, saying, listen, Congressman, we have the opportunity to buy more land from Mexico. I know it's kind of late, you want to go home tomorrow. How about passing the appropriations bill tonight? Well, it's kind of come on. Let's cut a few corners here and there. It's only a couple of million, which at that time was a lot. So they said, okay, fine, we'll have some kind of debate. So they signed up to participate in the debate, and Mr. David Wilmot signed up and was given like 5 minutes to make whatever statement he wanted. Wilmot was a Democrat, part of the great Democratic Party of Jefferson and Jackson. He was from Pennsylvania. And being a Democrat, he was friendly to the southern states. He was not an abolitionist, but he was from Pennsylvania. But he was also a Democrat. He was a junior congressman at that time. So he was safe. No problem giving him 5 minutes. Well, he gets up and he drops this bomb. He proposes a rider to the bill. And the rider states that neither slavery nor servitude shall exist in any part of the territory acquired from Mexico. Oh. So this is what happened. Oh my goodness. Why did he have to bring this on at that time? Because he was looking at slavery and the territories from the point of view of Pennsylvania. It was purely economic. He did not want those western lands to fall into the hands of people from the South who would advance an economy based on slavery. It was not that he was an abolitionist. It was all a question of interest, money, the welfare of his region, the welfare of his state. But this was a bomb. Up until then, you may remember, slavery was something that was kept out of Congress because it was not a federal issue. What Wilmot did is he brought slavery into the foreground of debates in the United States. He opened up a can of worms by saying this is something that we can not only argue, but also decide. We are going to assume the power of legislating for territories. Congress can have the power to legislate for slavery in the territories, the same way they have done with the Northwest Territory. Remember the Northwest Territory, the Great Lakes states where slavery was forbidden? That's what they did. Well, what happened to the Wilmot Proviso? There it is, written in longhand, with only one correction. It would have annulled the Missouri Compromise because it would have disregarded that 3630 line altogether. So the House voted to approve the proviso, but the House adjourned before the Senate could send it back. The following year, they reintroduced the proviso. It was approved, but then the Senate did not approve it. They tried to put it into the treaty with Mexico, but it was not approved either. The Wilmot Proviso caused all these problems, but was never approved. It was the only piece of non-legislation that had such a vast effect on the controversies of the time. Everybody was up in arms about this, both the southern states, the middle states, the northern states, because it involved everybody's wealth. This was about wealth and interest. It was not about ethics. It was not about morals. It was not about the morality of slavery. This was all about interest. This was all about wealth and money. And it never was approved. It never became law anywhere.
Why would the northern states be concerned as Wilmot then? If it's about wealth, why would they want the southern states, the new territory to be purchased with slavery that would continue their strong economic base that was based on slavery? Why was Wilmot alone on this? Why didn't he get more support?
Well, he had the support of the northern states.
But it wasn't enough.
Not in the Senate. Not in the
Oh,
Senate.
because it's two.
Control of the Senate was really the linchpin of Southern power. This is what was very important to them. Even in today's politics, control of the Senate is critical because the Senate approves judges, ambassadors, cabinet members, and the like. Control of the Senate is tremendous. Very, very important. Well, the Wilmot Proviso was a direct attack on slavery, according to the southern states. The Southerners felt insulted. There was widespread outrage. They could no longer count on the Democratic Party being friendly to them. That was a major problem that the Democratic Party, by allowing the Wilmot Proviso to be ventilated, have failed the southern states. And it explicitly introduced slavery as a subject for discussion. Up until then, it was ours. To add fuel to the fire, a number of southern gentlemen were around and that were masters in oratory. They were really powerful speakers. They used to be called the fire eaters because they could make a good argument for just about any cause. I suppose they must have been something like Rush Limbaugh. You may not have agreed with his politics, but he was a master in arguing. James Carlisle is also a very good debater.
Sam
Bill
Irwin.
O'Reilly.
Sam Irwin,
Yeah.
more recently.
Richard Nixon was also a very, very fierce debater. When David Frost took him on, he said afterwards, I never realized what an intelligent argument the man could make for just about any subject. So these were the fire eaters. The most important one, and we will come back to the fire eaters, was Mr. William Yancey. Yancey was a journalist, politician. He was an ambassador for a while. And he was a defender of Southern nationalism, of slavery, all the way to the end. He would never give in an inch. He served in Alabama in the U.S. House, and he authored and presented the Alabama platform that we will discuss in a moment. He embodied in the words of the Liberator everything that was wrong with the Southern elites. He would have fit perfectly in Tara or in 7 Oaks or 12 Oaks. It was 12 Oaks. In 12 Oaks. It was that kind of gentleman. Let's talk about the Alabama platform, which, again, the same way that history repeats itself, this will echo on years afterwards. The Alabama platform was approved by the Alabama Democratic Party in 1847, again, as a reaction to the Wilma Proviso. The Wilma Proviso was never approved, but it evoked a number of reactions. Number one, this is what the Alabama platform stated. The federal government cannot restrict slavery in the territories. The same way that Lincoln said, no, the federal government can't. The same way the federal government could restrict slavery in the territories of the Northwest. Yes, it did. So this was an issue of great debate. Territories could not prohibit slavery until they were ready to become a state. Delegates to the National Convention would oppose anybody that supported the Wilma Proviso. And the federal government has to support slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico. That was the Alabama platform. Yancey took the Alabama platform to the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore in 1848. And he presented that to the convention, and the convention voted on it. What happened? It was rejected by a vote of 36 to 216. A sound defeat. The Democratic Party did not want a piece of the Alabama Convention. So what does Yancey do? He throws a hissy fit, and he walks out of the convention, followed by one lonely delegate from Delaware. Not from Alabama, not from Georgia, not from South Carolina, not from Delaware. But he learned this lesson. This can be done. I can walk out of the convention and draw people out of the street. Let's wait another 12 years and see how he pulls the same trick while walking out of the convention. So he stormed out of the convention and went on to organize Southern rights associations and other kinds of parties like that himself. Also, as a response to the Roma Proviso, this is how he is said that this article that never became law had. John C. Calhoun organized the Mississippi Convention of 1849, during which they denounced the Roma Proviso and called for a larger convention in Nashville. So they meet in Nashville in June of 1850. Delegates for a number of states attended, but note that there were no delegates attending from Maryland, there were none from Delaware, there were none from Missouri, there were none from Kentucky, there were none from North Carolina.
Pennsylvania.
The obvious purpose of the convention was to further secession, was to create a forum.
South Carolina, or North Carolina.
North Carolina,
It's not.
North Carolina did not attend. South Carolina did attend. North Carolina did not attend this. Because obviously it was supposed to be in support of secession. But the convention really rejected the idea of secession at that time. Yeah, they said things like slavery should be protected by the Constitution, and the 3630 line should be extended out to the Pacific, and we'll have another convention in November that was controlled by a more radical group, but that ended up in nothing. But this convention was supposed, at least by the organizers, to support secession, but it did not. Therefore, secession did not move very far. There were a lot of problems after the Mexican War. There were various border issues, particularly affecting Texas. It was California because it had expanded so fast following the gold rush, and it wanted to be a state immediately without going through a territory. There was the issue of slavery in the territories. A bill had been introduced to forbid slavery in the District of Columbia, and the southern states demanded a fugitive slave law. Those were the major problems that the United States faced at the end of the Mexican War. Henry Clay, who had been in the U.S. House and Senate, Speaker, Secretary of State, he championed the Compromise of 1850. And the way it was originally proposed, it failed. Why? Because they proposed an omnibus bill. An omnibus, imagine a school bus, which is an omnibus, in which all kinds of different people walk on and takes them all in one direction. An omnibus bill is one in which many different aspects of different bills are added on, hoping that they will all get approved together. But the way this was presented at that time, there was enough material in the bill that would turn everybody off. Somebody had an objection. And everybody had an objection. So it was not approved originally. Stephen Douglas, that would eventually debate Lincoln in 1858, decided to own the compromise bill. So what he did was he cut up the bills into 5 different smaller bills. And he made coalitions. Okay, we free. Do you like this proposal? Relating California? Good. If you vote for California, we'll vote for the fugitive slave bill. Deal, okay? Over here, we agree on the fugitive slave bill. Good. If you do that, we'll support you in California. That way, he built small coalitions and got people to not vote or change their vote or be absent during the vote. To the point that the stipulations of the original bill were all approved. It was great political maneuvering. What was denied in the compromise of 1850? Well, the will not provides that Congress has control over slavery in the territories. That was rejected. The extension of the Missouri Compromise line, 3630 to the Pacific, that was also rejected. Popular sovereignty as the official position of the Democratic Party. Let me just make a parenthesis here and say a word about popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty was the concept that the people living in a territory before it became a state could decide by themselves whether they wanted slavery or not. That sounds very democratic, doesn't it? That people themselves decide. Makes sense to me. There's one exception. Where's Congress? If you accept that the people can decide, you leave Congress out of the equation. And legislators are not eager to give up any power. So for that reason, popular sovereignty may have been very popular with the people, but very unpopular with the Congress. You see the idea? The popular sovereignty was really not accepted as the position of the Democratic Party. There's the Alabama platform and several other proposals, including dividing the Southwest into two huge states with the Colorado River running right through. The compromise of 1850 eventually ended up as California being admitted as a free state, Texas agreeing to territories in the Panhandle being granted to other states in exchange for the U.S. government taking over the debt, the public debt of Texas. Utah and New Mexico will be organized as territories with popular sovereignty. The slave trade will be abolished in the District of Columbia, which was no big deal. You wanted to trade slaves? Well, that's what I said. Yeah, no problem. So this was no big concession. And finally, the fugitive slave law was drafted and approved. And there was a lot of debate over the compromise of 1850. The last few minutes, I want to go on to one more reaction to the Rome proposal, and that was the Georgia platform. The Georgia platform was also a response to the compromise of 1850, and it was authored by Charles Jenkins, who was a state legislator. This would become the cornerstone of policy of the southern states. It is written in beautiful, simple, reasonable language. Georgia is committed to the rights and principles perpetuated by the Union. The states do compromise in order to preserve the Union. Georgia does not agree with everything in the compromise of 1850, but we will live with it. And how more reasonable can you get? The state of Georgia, however, will resist and even secede if the federal government interferes with slavery, refuses to admit to statehood any territory because of slavery, or repeals or modifies the fugitive slave laws. And makes it very clear that the preservation of the Union depends on the enforcement of the fugitive slave. But this is almost, the sense that you get is that it just wants to bend over backwards. This is all we can do. We do not want to split the Union. We want to live with each other. You give in a little, we give in a little. We made it work. And it did for a number of years. This was like the resolution for which many of the states were living with. A lot has been written about the slave power or the slave office. This is a conspiracy theory that wealthy Southern slave owners were hanging on to political control of the state and federal governments to advance their wealth and slavery. On the other hand, opponents of slave power complain of slavery on ethical and moral grounds. Politicians were threatened by political balance in U.S. institutions like the U.S. Senate. There was an economic aspect to it, the inability of free states to compete with unwaged slave labor. And finally, free souls that the slave states would take over all the good land and leave nothing for free trade. Was there any evidence to the existence of this slave power? In the first 71 years, of the 16 presidents, 11 came from the South. That is 69%. Of Supreme Court justices, 17 out of 28, 61%. Attorneys General, 74%. This is all the United States, not states, federal. Presidents pro tem of the Senate, 79%. Speakers of the House, 64%. Foreign ministers, 63%. Those are the statistics. So obviously, maybe the Southern gentlemen were more educated.
They had one thing in common, and that was the need of slavery to support their economy. And that wasn't true in the North.
And they
And so
were,
this isn't surprising,
it's not surprising.
but it's sobering.
It is, because this is the way it was, that they really had a significant control over the lands of government, for better or for worse.
of the federal, but they had virtual control of their state legislatures. Even
This
statistically,
is all federal.
right. So specifically at the state level,
Oh,
they control the southern legislatures in their own interests. Because when you go back to John C. Calhoun, he made the point that, the tariff is hurting, the South, especially South Carolina, because they didn't have manufacturing. Well, they didn't have manufacturing of their own decision. They could have had manufacturing if they chose.
I know.
Right. So I think his point is illegitimate. That's just my opinion.
Great, thank you so very much.
I would agree, manufacturing shows needed water power mainly to operate machinery. Greenland was abundant of that, hills and streams, valleys, where the south was flat. And so there wasn't, you just can't say it should be manufactured, water power.
Well, thank you so much for staying late.